Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody, and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the Doctor Who novelizations put out by Target Books from 1973 onward in publication order. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. We are currently done with the 1979 books, and for the second time in my life, I am finished with the 1970s. Next week, we'll be starting Season 4 of this program, beginning with 1980. Every season of this program corresponds to 2 years' worth of Target publications, so Season 4 will cover 1980 and 1981, and then we take a break by doing a bonus episode in between seasons. 1981 was a pretty light year on the Target calendar, so the next bonus episode after this one is probably coming up not too far off from now. This week coincides with my returning home from L.I. Who. That's the Long Island Doctor Who convention, which began in 2013. I believe this was the 8th year of the convention. They missed a couple of years, partly because of the pandemic, and this was my 7th time in attendance. Always have a good time at L.I. Who, make new friends every time out. This year, what I've done is I've brought my microphone, and I've gotten some interviews for you guys to listen to. Some of the interviews are with longtime fan friends of mine, a couple whose voices you'll have heard on this podcast before. And I also, through the generosity of Irene Richard, who is the director of media for L.I. Who, and Doctor Who podcaster, and a friend of mine, Drew Meyer, who was very generous with his contacts, I was able to get interviews with 4 of the guests who were present at L.I. Who for the weekend. I will be playing, with the permission of each guest, a 1-minute excerpt from those interviews here. That is going to be a separate episode of the Trap 1 podcast that I'm cutting together. You'll be able to hear all 4 of those interviews in their entirety on Trap 1. That's an episode probably coming out a few days after this drops on Sunday, the 27th of November. But again, you'll be hearing a minute of those interviews and then the entirety on Trap 1. The interviews with my fan friends are exclusive to the Doctor Who Literature podcast, and those will be coming up in a couple of minutes. At the end of the show, after the interviews, I will be doing what I did last year. I will be selecting one random classic Doctor Who episode out of the archives. I do not yet know, as I lay down this track, which episode it will be, and I will start recording an audio commentary for that episode as soon as I select it and press play on my media drive. I will not have done any research. This will just be an instant fan commentary talking about the historical perspective of the episode when it was made, who made it, when I first saw it, what I thought of it then, what I thought of it now, and of course, because this is primarily a books podcast, what I thought of the novelization, whether or not it's a book that we've covered on Doctor Who literature before. One of the nice things about L.I. Who is that thanks to the generosity of program director Billy Davis, I get to speak on a lot of panels. So I did 4 panels at L.I. Who this year, 2 on the Saturday, 2 on the Sunday. On Saturday, I did a presentation that I've been doing every year since the con started in 2013, which is cliffhangers. That's where I select a bunch of classic series and new series cliffhangers, as many as I can show in a 55-minute panel. And I have a guest host along with me on stage, and we talk about the cliffhangers and whether or not they work, don't work, funny, not funny, scary, not scary. This year, as I have been joined for the last several years, Drew Walko was on stage with me, and also Heather, whose voice you'll be hearing a little bit later on during this podcast. So all 3 of us played a bunch of primarily classic series cliffhangers, tried to show 2 from each Doctor. The theme of L.I. Who this year was L.I. Who presents Meglos. So, of course, I did show a cliffhanger from Meglos because how could you not? And every year, the first cliffhanger that I show is the very first from Unearthly Child. and I always exit the panel by playing and singing along to the Ballad of the Last Chance Saloon, which is one of my all-time favorite cliffhangers. That is part 1 of The Gunfighters. I also moderated on the Saturday night a panel discussing the Third Doctor as it relates to the James Bond universe. The Third Doctor, John Pertwee being the James Bond of the Doctor Who world. Had a lot of fun talking about good memories of the Pertwee era and, of course, the James Bond movies. On Sunday morning, I moderated a panel on the Russell T. Davies eras of the show, 2005 through 2010, and, of course, what we are all expecting from the new RTD return, which is coming in 2023. Had a lot of good panelists up on stage with me. And then later in the day, pinch hitting for Jan Fennick, whose voice you'll hear shortly, I moderated on short notice a panel on the Chibnall era. What we thought of Chris Chibnall's tenure as showrunner versus what we thought of Jodie Whittaker's time as the Doctor. There will be a couple of episodes on Trap 1 coming up, one devoted to the Chibnall era, one devoted to Jodie and her best moments. I will probably be moderating the Jodie episode, and of course I will post links to both of those Trap 1 episodes in the show notes after they are recorded and produced and released. So I had a good time at Li Who, talking about the classic series, talking about the new series, meeting friends new and old. And what I'll do now is play for you a series of interviews, first with my friends, and then 1-minute excerpts from my interviews with some of the guests who were at Li Who. And after that, my impromptu, unrehearsed audio commentary for one random Doctor Who episode. Let's get to it.
Hello, fellow time travelers, and welcome to the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, the only podcast to discuss, in story order, all the Doctor Who novelizations. My name is Tony Whitt, and every 2 weeks or so, I'm joined by a 2 to 3 person discussion panel, including our so-called expert who's been a Who fan since 1979. That would be me. We also get the views of intermediate, casual, and novice fans who either have never seen the show or who have never read these books until these podcasts, including
Dalton Hughes
and
Alison Fitz-Seyfried.
You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you find good podcasts, or even ones like ours. You're listening to the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. Enjoy your travels.
Okay, so I'm here at Li Who with Hannah Long, who's been a guest of the show back on episode 15, The Green Death. Hannah, welcome back.
Good to be back.
This is what number at Li Who for you? Your third, I think?
Third, yeah. It's good to be back. It's always a lot of fun to get out here from Brooklyn early in the morning.
Yeah, for me it was about a 90-minute drive last night. Hopefully you had a much easier commute.
No, it was much worse, but it's always worth it. It's a journey. It's like a Doctor Who episode.
More of a six-parter than a two-parter, probably.
Something like that. Yes, it's too much padding.
So you came to my attention last year because you were cosplaying as Polly from the 60s, and today you're in a Tom Baker scarf.
I am. I've got a sort of like military-style jacket on with a patch that says unit that I sewed on last night. That's about as much effort as I could put into the costume this year because I ran out of time.
That's more effort than I put in, so that's good. Where did you come by the Tom Baker scarf?
My sister made this. She loves making props and various things from TV shows, and so she knitted this. She made me a sonic screwdriver, which she whittled out of wood, filled with glue, and stuck a crystal on the end. So she is something else.
That is great. And your cap, too, is a military theme. You have the fatigue cap.
That's right. I used to wear it when I played paintball.
So who are the big attractions for you this year? Which guests are you here to see?
Well, I signed up before I saw any of the guests just because I had such a good time last year, but I hadn't seen Wendy Padbury before. That's just wonderful. I love Jamie and Zoe, and The Mind Robber is my favorite Doctor Who episode, so it's just wonderful to see all of them together. I love seeing Peter Davison, with whom I'm very sympathetic on the way he thinks about the show, talks about the show. I just always enjoy hearing him talk about it, and he's a lot of fun. So
he does not hold back.
He does not. I tend to agree with him, though. So.
He does not varnish things. And I just sat next to you in the Kevin McNally panel. You had a couple of really good questions, and he actually enjoyed your questions. What did he say to you?
Oh, he said it was a deep question, which I appreciated. I think a lot about acting because I write about film and TV, and so just thinking about performance and objectivity and how you kind of are able to look at yourself as an artist is something that I find very interesting, especially as a book editor as well. So yeah, it was nice to chat with him. Last year I got to chat with Michael Jaston for like 30 minutes about acting and about the Royal Shakespeare Company and all of that stuff. So I think it was all in the back of my head this time as well, as like come up with some good acting questions.
And Kevin McNally especially has a career going back at least 50 years, and he's been in everything from blockbusters to American TV to The Twin Dilemma.
Yeah, and he's one of my favorite character actors. I didn't get a chance to say, but he's one of those guys like Thomas Mitchell or Claude Rains who every time I see him pop up in something, I'm like, oh, this is going to be good.
And then after he complimented you for the deep question, he turned to the audience and says, come on, where are the nerds? He was looking for more, I think, Doctor Who-related questions. So we were talking earlier as well. You, of course, do writing as your primary career, I believe.
Well, I'm mostly a book editor, though. I that's the day job, and then I freelance at different places. The Dispatch, recently Spectator World, recently Plow Magazine, just places around where I kind of get to talk about the arts and stuff like that, which I really have a lot of passion for. We
were talking a little bit about Better Call Saul, and as longtime listeners of this show know, this is a Better Call Saul house. That is a very influential show for me. So I'm curious now, you've seen the last episode. What was your perspective on the last episode, and what is the gist of your piece?
Well, I'm writing primarily about the systems. I'm trying to figure out a way to make this sound less boring. Systems of morality throughout the show, because I think that it is a show about how are you a good person, and when that it doesn't always coincide with being a legally observant person. They usually go together, but not always. And so trying to figure out what the right thing to do is a theme throughout the series. And so I kind of analyze a lot of the philosophies that characters express in the show. You have, Chuck, who's very legalistic in many ways, but who has a view of an abstract standard of good and evil, which I think is necessary when you have people who are much more morally relativistic in the show. Someone like Mike Rimmertrout, who is talking about, all that really matters is that you adhere to your personal code. And he, as you can see throughout the show, he doesn't even really do that. He's living in a sense of self-deception. And a lot of the characters sort of deceive themselves, and that happens throughout the show. So there's kind of this sense that, like, you do need some sort of higher law. You need something to kind of determine what good and evil is. And I think all that kind of comes to the fore in the last episode, is that even if you can live this whole life feeling like you're getting away with it, but Jimmy, or Saul, or whatever you want to call him in the final episode, he doesn't feel like he's gotten away with anything. And that's, I think, what motivates his final decisions, is that he realizes that he needs to react to the fact that there is a law of good and evil out there, and he needs to start acting like there is. And I think that's a way that he kind of recovers a piece of his soul, as they refer to it. So anyway, I draw all of that in, I talk about some of the sort of religious language of the show and of Vince Gilligan, the show's creator, that kind of adds an element to the piece, but that's what I've been thinking about for a few months.
Yeah, the last episode was tremendous for me. It's a little unrealistic that Jimmy goes to a place like the Federal Supermax in Colorado and is treated like a rock star. That may have been stretching him a little bit, but he's finally happy with himself after he sacrifices a sweetheart deal to help salvage Kim Wexler.
Yeah.
So I thought that was considering that Breaking Bad, the parent show, ended as a hardcore revenge fantasy, and Walter White doesn't make it through the end of the episode.
Yeah.
It was good to see Saul get a much more relatively happier ending, I think.
Yeah, and I felt like it was significantly less glamorous in certain ways, which was, I think, more true and authentic to the themes of the story. That it felt, it didn't feel as much like it was, because the thing about Walter is that he was someone who was a terrible person, and yet it almost felt like he got what he wanted in the end. And so how are we supposed to feel about that? I think that it's a bittersweet ending for him, but there's kind of this sense in which a lot of people can watch it and feel like, oh, well, he got what he wanted in the end, and maybe this is a happy ending for him. And it's sort of a mixed with Jimmy. There's a sense in which no, you can't get what you want in the end when it's something like that and still be happy. Like that is genuinely a wicked thing.
And I think there's a longer conversation to be had about Chuck, Jimmy's older brother. Chuck really commits the original sin by trying to sabotage Jimmy's career at every turn, even trying to get Jimmy to change his name, which is a plot point in the very first episode, which is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And Chuck, of course, does not make it all the way through the end of the series until he shows up sort of as the voice of reason again in the very last episode. I think Chuck's role is debatable, but this is primarily the Doctor Who podcast, so let's just circle back around at the end. Have you been following the most recent Doctor Who episodes, the end of the Chris Chibnall era?
I did. Somewhat against my better judgment, but that's mean. I actually did enjoy catching up because I remember last time we talked I had not seen Flux, and I did watch it, and I thought it was the best part of the Chibnall era by a country mile. I didn't think it quite stuck the landing, but there were a lot of great ideas that it threw up in the air. I really enjoyed Kevin McNally in it as Professor Jericho in particular. I think because it was a sort of character that in a way is a bit of a trope, is sort of the blustery British professor. Like they knew how to write that in a way that really felt like lived in, and I thought that he felt more vividly realized than any other companion in the Chibnall era, which I really appreciated. And so I cared about his character. I thought that there were just a lot of great ideas for villains in that. Visually it looked fantastic, which is surprising given all of the COVID restrictions. I thought that the specials after that were a bit rough. They kind of all over the place, and I found my attention wandering severely in the Pirates one. But and then the ending itself, well, it was sort of fan service, I guess. I remember very little about the story. I enjoyed the Master in it a great deal. I think he always kind of arrives on set knowing what he wants to do and carries a lot of the story with him, even if he's carrying it into a storyline that doesn't make any sense as this one did. but it was fun.
And as someone who's a fan of the older eras of the show, what did it mean to you at the very end when the old companions came back, going all the way back to William Russell and Katie Manning?
I really enjoyed seeing William Russell. I felt like the scene itself was... there just wasn't much to it, you know? It didn't seem to have a whole lot of thought put into, can we find a way to make them fit into this story as this story? Like, I loved Elizabeth Sladen coming back in New Who, partly because it made sense for the story for her to be there. Like,
School reunion is about her.
Yeah, there's a dramatic reason for her to need to be there. Is that Rose at that point in her story needs to know that she is not the only person in the Doctor's life. He has this history, and so it really kind of makes it a really interesting, dramatic thing. I wish that had been there'd been a little bit more thought put into which companions are we doing this with? How can we really create an interesting, dramatic reason for them to be here? And there wasn't as much of that. I mean, I did enjoy seeing them, but I wish it had been a little bit different. If I was in charge, obviously, it'd be great.
Well, today, as we record this, is William Russell's 98th birthday, so getting him back for more than a 6-word cameo logistically might be tough, but I really wish he'd had more to do.
Yeah. No, it was wonderful to see him. I really wished that he and Carol Ann Ford had popped up in the end of the Capaldi era, because it seemed like it made perfect sense to do that there. So I'm glad that it did happen, at least.
Yes, at the very least. Well, Hannah Long, thank you so much for rejoining us. Hope to speak to you again soon.
Yeah, sure thing.
So I'm joined now by my co-presenter on the Cliffhangers! Panel at Li Who, Heather. And we have with us Heather's son, Wesley. Wesley, welcome. You are the first teenager on Doctor Who literature. Happy to have you. So, Heather and Wesley, we're here to talk Li Who. How many years have you been coming?
So this is my third one?
I think so. I've been here since Li Who 2, except for I missed 2017 because I had a job interview, which panned out. It is my job now, so it was worth it. But
well, that's a good trade-off.
But I was very sad to miss it.
Yeah, 2013 was my first, but I met you on I think we did a Peter Purvis panel together in 2014. I think that was where I met you for the first time.
I believe that's accurate.
And when Wesley started coming, he was half my size, and now he's twice my size. So the passage of time marches on. So Wesley, you are one of the few teenagers here, and I believe you actually read the Target novelizations, or some of them, have you?
Yes, I've read 3, The Sea Devils, Invasion of the Dinosaurs, and Day of the Doctor.
So 2 of those we've covered on Doctor Who literature already. We're going in publication order. This episode is in between the last of the 1979s and the first of the 1980s. So we've already talked about the Sea Devils and the dinosaur invasion. Day of the Doctor is going to be a long, long, long way off. But you've read 2 Pertwee books. Are you a fan of the Pertwee era?
I'm a big fan of the TV show episodes, but definitely the thing that is clearest in Sea Devils, but also most importantly, very much in the dinosaur invasion, is the special effects budget. And I think that is where the novels really have their strength, is that you can... Because Invasion of the Dinosaurs is a very, very good story with very, very strong themes, and I feel like that is made much clearer in the novel when you're not looking at some puppet dinosaur, although perhaps that's part of its charm.
Yes, nothing dates faster than special effects. But do you recall in Dinosaur Invasion how Malcolm Hulk writes POV from the dinosaurs itself?
Yes, that's something you wouldn't get in a TV show. That is another one of the things you can do with the novelizations, is you can sort of push the limits of what you're doing. Gonna detour quickly to Day of the Doctor. There's lots of strange things there where you have it from the perspective of the 2 Osgoods, and there's no doctor present. You have it from the perspective of the curator, which of course you don't get very much of him in the actual episode. You have the chance to sort of look at different perspectives and different things you couldn't do in the show or in your runtime.
It's interesting because when you're reading Day of the Doctor, the question is always which doctor is narrating this particular scene, and the answer is never the one you expect.
Yeah.
Now, Heather, you had thought that you hadn't read any of the novelizations, but after I booked you for this and before we started recording, you came to a realization.
Well, actually, Wesley pointed out to me that Day of the Doctor is a Target novel, which I believe was a birthday present to me from my family, and I enjoyed it so much that, you know, I keep thinking, this is obviously a huge gap in my Doctor Who experience that I need to rectify. I really enjoyed it, and I think part of it is that you have that flexibility to give different points of view, different perspectives, and to sort of do some narrative things that don't really work on film, just as the film lets you do some things that don't work on the page.
So Wesley, for you, what's the appeal of coming to Li Who?
I feel like, especially right now when the show is not at its peak of popularity, and living in the United States, it's very hard to find people who are into the show and you can really talk to the show about. You have to, if you can come here, there's all sorts of people who love the show, and of course we're all here to talk about it. It's very nice to, you know, be able to finally share some of that love that I have for the show.
That's a great point. How about you, Heather?
I think that was well said. Partly, I love panels. I love watching them, I love being on them, I love planning them, I love everything about discussion panels. And so I usually come and load up my schedule with a bunch of different panel ideas, and then I spend the entire day listening to people talk about Doctor Who and talking about Doctor Who.
What other panels are you going to be on this weekend?
I have a Black Guardian panel this evening, and then a panel after that this evening called Energy Levels Are Off the Charts, which is about power and, you know, like physical power, electricity, energy in Doctor Who, and how it's tied to social and political power, and how that relates to the real world. So I'm pretty excited about that.
All right, Heather, Wesley, thanks so much for joining me, and I'm sure I'll see you again here next year.
Thank
We
you.
plan on it.
So we're here with Jan Fennick. Jan has been on the podcast before. She was my guest for the Claws of Axos episode a few months ago, and now she's back talking about Elihu. Jan, welcome back.
Thank you.
And of course, you and I have done several Trap Ones together, talking about various aspects of the 13th Doctor / Chris Chibnall era.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately. We're doing a couple of panels together tomorrow, the Sunday of the convention. We're going to be recapping the old and previewing the new RTD era, and we're going to be doing an entertaining post-mortem on the Chris Chibnall era as well. I believe, correct?
That is correct. And Russell gave us a nice little gift this week by giving us the new companion. That's definitely something we'll be talking about tomorrow morning.
Yes, Millie Gibson.
Yeah, she seems interesting. My first initial reaction to her was a little, I don't want to say knee-jerk, but I was a little bit caustic about it. But then I saw an interview with her, with question and answer between her and Shooty, and it was absolutely adorable. And they have great chemistry and great rapport. And so I'm suddenly okay, I really, really like her, except I hate the name, and I will die on that hill. It's a stupid name. Russell, don't name people after Rolling Stones songs and then change the last name just to be clever.
Yeah, Ruby Sunday is not.
Yeah.
It's more like a dessert or a stripper name. It doesn't really seem very fitting.
Yeah, either that or it's a bad groupie name. He watched Almost Famous one too many times. I'm going to name her after her. Stop! Don't do that.
Yeah, I played a little bit of the interview between her and Shooty on the podcast last week because that dropped while we were at Elihu. This is coming out a week later. So my audience has heard part of that already, if not the whole thing. But yeah, I'm looking forward to that. So how long have you been coming to Elihu?
I've been coming since the first year, which I've lost track now. I want to say that was 2012, 2013.
It was 2013 because that was when I met you for the first time.
Okay.
We had a panel together on the very first night.
That's right. Yeah, that was the Peter Davison panel.
Yes, the Peter Davison panel.
Where I had total stage fright and completely brain blanked and could barely speak. And thankfully, Jason saved the day because people probably thought I was on drugs. I just completely brain froze.
Now, long-time listeners of this podcast will know that brain blanks and freezes are my middle name, so you're certainly in good company in that regard.
Yeah, I've gotten better with panels since then. It was just stage fright. I just froze.
So what has your role been during the convention this year?
I'm the masquerade / costume events coordinator. So we did a masquerade on Saturday night, tonight, at 8 p.m., which went very well. And as usual, it's a little bit of chaos, but fun chaos. So everybody would sign up. It does sign up at literally the last minute. And I think I have nobody who's going to come into it. And then suddenly I've got 15 people running at me and saying, I need a card. Can it still be in there? And of course they can. This year we had 3 little kids who were absolutely adorable.
Oh, my goodness. That's great.
Yeah. One was I want to say he's 3 now, who was River Song because he was wearing a spacesuit, etc., and he has adorable little curls, and he'd pull the helmet off and then shake his head.
Oh my!
Then we had a baby Ace, so I want to say she was probably about 4 or 5.
Hey, I've seen her in the hallway. She's adorable and a half.
Yeah, and then we had I want to say he was probably somewhere in the 8-9 years old 5th Doctor, who was really into it also. So
yeah, he came to one of my panels earlier, my Cliffhangers panel. So yes, I've seen him.
And it's to me, it's having been a Doctor Who fan for the past 40-something years, to see it's not even the next generation now. It's the next generation. The next
generation's little kids.
Yeah, and it just it does my heart good to see that the show is it's 60 years on and the show is still going on and there's still fans who are, and these little kids are really, really into it. And meanwhile, you have people who are in their 60s and 70s who've been watching the show since they were it first aired, and they were children, not necessarily here, but in the UK definitely. And it's just a multi-generational thing, and I think that's really wonderful.
Yeah, it's always good to have children at cons rather than older people like us.
Yes, well,
people like us who are rapidly approaching middle age.
I'm I think I'm past that hump already, but because I'm the same age as the show. And the other thing that just speaking of age today, that was really kind of scary. Somebody else mentioned online that the combined age of Shooty and Millie is 48.
That's younger than I am.
That's younger than I am also, and Millie was talking in her interview about how she grew up on the David Tennant and Matt Smith era, which in a way is good that we've now got people who are coming into the show who actually, there's the show again, because when Matt was cast, he had never seen Doctor Who, and Karen Gillan had never seen Doctor Who. But on the other hand, it was I was I'm 18 now, I was watching this, 10 years ago when I was a little kid, and I was just eep. I was definitely in double digits. We won't talk about my age, but So it's like, oh God, I was a full-grown adult and, this and that. And yeah, you were a child like when David Tennant was there, so.
Yeah, the interview with Shruti and Millie, again, which I played on the show last week, I think I played the excerpt where she says that she was a little girl, a little kid, and she was watching with her dad, and they were watching the Matt Smith and Peter Capaldi eras, and she remembers the episode where Jodie Whittaker fights the witches. That was like 3 years ago.
Apparently a long, long time ago when you're only 18. Or it's like last week if you're old, like me, so. Well, the beating heart of Doctor Who on TV has always been young people going back to Verity Lambert in her 20s making this show from nothing. So yeah. We're happy to see the next generation take over. What's been your favorite part of the con so far? I think just interaction and being able to see people again. And the last convention that I went to was New York Comic Con, which, especially having been through lockdown and not a lot of socialization, that was just like trial by fire. It was horrible because there were so many people. It was so big. It was so hot. Whereas here, I'm not sure how many people we have here, but I know our cap was 500. So it seems like very intimate, very quiet comparatively, and it's much more easy to people here and to connect people and to talk to people and just kind of have some relaxed fun. So for me, it really has been socialization, just kind of hanging out and having chats with people. Much less commercialized and regimented than New York Comic Con, which is definitely massive. All right, Jen, thanks so much. We'll have you on Trap One again real soon. Take care now. Awesome. Bye-bye. Coming up next will be excerpts from my 4 guest interviews in the following order. Bhavnisha Parmar, who goes by Bav. She played Yaz's sister, Sonia Khan, in 6 episodes of the just-concluded Chris Chibnall / Jodie Whittaker era. An interview with John Davey, who played he's played, I think, 50 different monsters in the new series so far. And we have Matthew Jacobs and Vanessa Ewell. Matthew co-wrote the 1996 Doctor Who TV movie, which aired on the Fox network here in the States. And Vanessa Ewell, who is his co-director on Doctor Who Am I?, a documentary about that TV movie, which premiered at LI Who the night before I arrived, so I did not get a chance to see it. I've heard very good things about it. It is coming theatrically to the United States in early 2023. It was a blast talking to them. And then coming up at the end will be an excerpt from my interview with Wendy Padbury, who is best known to us as Zoe, and also an agent who discovered Matt Smith. So here are excerpts from the following 4 interviews.
How do I get cast as Sonia? So as you do, you get a call from your agent, and I didn't really know what the show was to begin with, because they can't tell you what you're necessarily going up for at the beginning. So it was great because I kind of went in. It was one of my bigger auditions. I've been auditioning with the BBC a lot for different shows, so it was one of my bigger auditions. And when I got in, I just felt very comfortable. I got the kind of character of. So I auditioned for Yaz first, and I got that kind of it just felt like I was oh, this is a character I could really play. Anyway, so I went to the audition, and yeah, I had a really good feeling. And then I had a call from my agent saying, okay, they really liked you, they want to see you again. So I kind of went through the iterations of auditioning for Yaz, and then I didn't get Yaz, but they kind of called up a few weeks later and said, we would love you to have you as a sister. So it was great. It was kind of an emotional roller coaster for a bit, but I'm glad I was able to be a part of it after everything. So yeah.
Rewind back to 2004, where I had a audition to be one of the Cybermen. At the time, I didn't know that's what it was for, and we spent a day with 50 guys in the BBC studios in Llandaff doing various movement exercises with the choreographer Elsa Burke. At the end of the day, they then said, this has been an audition to be the Cybermen on Doctor Who, and being a huge Doctor Who fan as a child, I was so excited. They also said, by the way, you're not allowed to tell anyone because it's all top secret. So I waited at home with my fingers crossed, and then eventually went to Millennium Effects Studios, Neil Gorton's company, where we tried on the suit. And if the proverbial suit fit, then we had the job. We did the 4 episodes with David Tennant in Series 2, and I thought, wow, that's an amazing experience. I'm so happy and so privileged to be on the show.
I had pretty much a free rein because they didn't want me taking anything from stuff that other writers had been trying to do in terms of resurrecting it in the States. So I had pretty much a blank slate, which was good.
That's wonderful. And Vanessa, before you came to this project, had you been a Doctor Who fan growing up?
Yes. In terms of, I had a nostalgic memory of it from it being on PBS in the 1980s. I was very young, but I remember watching it with my dad and my family. I loved the TARDIS, and just I have vague memories of it. And then I think I mentioned at the panel yesterday too, there was the song in like the 90s from KLF, like Doctor Who, hey, the TARDIS. This. And I just remember being like, I'm so cool, I know what that is, so I mean that song too. But really, it was just a nostalgia.
We watched Doctor Who as fans as a 25 or nowadays a 45-minute show. So for us, it's a 25-minute commitment. For you, it was a full-time job. You're doing 50, 60, 70-hour weeks between rehearsals and location shooting and studio and publicity. What was Doctor Who like for you as a job for the 2 years that you were on the show? What was it like going to work and dealing with your castmates and the crew and everybody?
It was wonderful. I mean, it wasn't really like a job in as much as we all got on so well. Pat Fraser and I got on really, really well. And we developed quite a chemistry quite quickly. And so getting up and going to work in the morning was an absolute pleasure. Also, don't forget, I was 21 years old. So, I would have no right to say that I was tired. But it was a wonderful job, a really wonderful job. Who'd have thought that I'd be sitting here however many years later talking about those years.
It's been about 10 or 15 years since then.
Something like that, yeah. Let's say that, yes.
And that was Bav, John, Matthew and Vanessa, and Wendy Padbury. You can catch the full versions of those interviews on Trap One within the coming week. After the break, I will be selecting a random Doctor Who story, telling you why I did that, and then I will have my unrehearsed and unprepared commentary. I hope you join me after the break. For the last part of this bonus episode, I'm going to do something that I did last year for Doctor Who's birthday, November 23rd. This year, of course, was the 59th birthday. Last year, I told you about an episode of one of my favorite podcasts, This Week in Baseball History. Now, I bring this up knowing that more than half of my listeners are from the UK. So I'm not talking about This Week in Baseball History as a positive recommendation for all of you guys, but it is a podcast that talks about the entire history of organized baseball, which in the United States goes back to 1869. So this is a show that has more than 150 years of a particular topic to delve into. Last year, one of the hosts did a solo episode where he picked one game at random out of the entire history of baseball, because the podcast focuses on baseball history. So every week they take some major historical event and discuss how it happened and why and what the implications are, etc., etc. But the fact of the matter is that most games played in baseball, and every team plays up to 162 games a year. There are currently 30 teams. Multiply that times 150. That's an awful lot of games, not even counting the postseason and all-star games. The point is that most of those games are ordinary and they are not of any historical interest whatsoever. History is generally what happens in between those games, or during the off-season, or in the boardroom, or in the media, or in pop culture at large. So if you take any random baseball game, if it survives on video or on audio recording, and of course nothing survives before 1934. So that's a good 65 years of baseball history that are entirely lost to the generations. if you take any one of those games at random, it's not going to be of historical interest. Of course, the fact is the one game that they ended up selecting for that random episode wound up being a game that set a historical milestone for the first time. So even by accident, they found a game of historical significance. Last year, I did the same thing for Doctor Who. Not every episode is going to be Pyramids of Mars, or An Unearthly Child Part 1, or The 10th Planet Part 4, or The Caves of Androzani, or The Curse of Fenric, or Blink, or Midnight, or Turn Left, or what have you. Not every episode also is going to be The Twin Dilemma, or Fear Her, or Meglos, or The Space Museum. I name those latter stories not to insult them, but just to generally acknowledge that if you ask Doctor Who fans what are their least favorite episodes, those are the names that are most likely to come up. I happen to like Space Museum, but that's a story for another day. In other words, if you pick any one random Doctor Who episode, it's probably going to be ordinary, forgettable, adequate, replacement level, to use a baseball analytics phrase. So what I'm going to do, what I did last year, is I picked randomly one episode from Image of the Fendal and one episode from Colony in Space, and I did a sort of impromptu fans audio commentary for those two tales. This year we've had a lot of other things going on in the episode, and my many thanks to those of you who are still listening. So what I'm going to be doing is picking one episode, and I'm going to talk over it basically from a historical perspective, how I discovered the episode, my instant reaction to it then, my reaction to it now, what I thought of the novelization. So let's go to our random online episode generator. This is the same one that I use when I'm picking Guess That Cliffhanger. And this is episodegenerator.com/doctor-who-old. Season 23, Episode 5, The Trial of a Time Lord, Part 5, or as we colloquially know it, Mind Warp Part 1. All right, not one of my favorites. Well, the project is the project, and as we'll talk about next week, the quest is the quest. Let's get to it. So we're now about 10 seconds into the episode. Hopefully you are following along with me. The first time that I would have seen Mind Warp, to the best of my recollection, and Mind Warp as some folks call it, folks who like to pronounce it correctly, probably came to PBS in the autumn of 1987. These aired in the UK, obviously, between September and December 1986. It was the first time that Doctor Who was dropped down to a 13-episode or 13-week season. Well, that's not actually true. All of the Peter Davison and Colin Baker episodes had aired in 13-week seasons, but that was either 2 episodes a week or a single 45-minute episode a week. This is the first time that Doctor Who has dropped down to 13 25-minute episodes, its shortest season to date, and that would be the standard all the way up through the show's cancellation with season 26, 1989. My recollection is that The Mysterious Planet, what we call Trial of a Time Lord Parts 1 through 4, would have come to the States around Rosh Hashanah 1987. That would have been about September, possibly October, because we had company, we had relatives from out of town staying with us, and the kids were watching the episode over my shoulder with a lot less enthusiasm than I was, I might add. At that point, Channel 21 was airing the show in episodic format on Saturday or Sunday afternoon, I forget which. It went back and forth, but they would show part 1, station break, part 2, station break, etc. And they would show the entire serial within a 90-minute or so time slot. I had outgrown my original obsession with Doctor Who. I'd already seen just about every episode that had been on PBS twice. Then I was now in high school and I was moving on to other interests. I was getting back into baseball, girls, Star Trek, a lot of other demands on my time. It wasn't really until I got to college and discovered Rec Arts Doctor Who in 1992 that I really rejoined fandom again in a serious way. But at this point I was basically a casual fan. Mind Warp, I had the novelization before I ever saw the episode on television. And I think I also had Ultimate Foe, the novelization, before I ever saw the story on television. So the fact that Perry dies at the end of Mind Warp, spoiler alert, sorry, the fact that Perry dies had already been spoiled for me, and the fact that she actually didn't die was also spoiled for me by the novelizations. And I already would have known. Now, we're now at the outdoor sequence on Thoros Beta, or whatever planet this takes place on. This is a really interesting use of special effects. Doctor Who had never really done graphics like this before. They couldn't have. So you have the ringed moon and the green sky over the pink ocean. A really interesting way to take Doctor Who on location and make it look like an alien planet rather than just a typical shingle beach or rock quarry. Really eye-popping. So I had already read from the novelizations 2 different variants on what happened to Perry. There was the official variant in the Pip and Jane Baker novelization of The Ultimate Foe, that she was made queen to King Urkanos, who of course is introduced in this story. But I also had the Philip Martin novelization of Mind Warp, which to my mind has a much better, and in my headcanon, the official explanation for Perry's exit, that she and Urkanos go to Earth and move to California, and he becomes a pro wrestler, and their fans are called the Varumniks, and Perry becomes his manager. That's really a sweet and charming ending. And one of the last new adventures, I think it was either December '96 or I think it was December '96. Bad Therapy gives a much darker take on what happens to Perry. She's unhappy on the planet with Urkanos and ends up going back to Earth and slapping the Doctor in the face. That's not really my wheelhouse. I much prefer companions getting happier exits. And thanks to the Pete McTighe trailer for the season 22 Blu-ray, we now of course have a much happier ending for Perry. But again, if you ask me which one I prefer, it's the Philip Martin novelization of this particular story. One of the things that grabbed me, I had not liked Colin Baker's first season. When I saw Trial of a Time Lord in the States in '87, what I loved about it is that the Doctor and Perry were suddenly getting along, and then they had also dropped the pretense that Perry was an American. That accent was not fooling me. In Mysterious Planet, she's practically using a British accent and considers London to be her home base. So the relationship between the two of them was much improved for me in Mysterious Planet. Now we go back to this story, and they're going to be at conflict for almost all of the story, beginning with this scene. Again, that kind of abrasive relationship between the Doctor and companion doesn't interest me. If we're talking about a teenage boy or a tween boy, as I was when I started watching the show, Michael Jaston as the Valeyard. Interesting character, that man. I've seen him at a couple of conventions. Ask me offline. So yeah, at heart, when you're a boy of that age or a girl of that age or any fan of that age, what do you want? You want to be the Doctor's traveling companion. So to have this prolonged relationship between the Doctor and Perry where they kind of hate each other just doesn't really work for me. So I also had not been a huge fan of Vengeance on Varos. I enjoyed it the very first time that I saw it, but after that it just never quite worked for me. A little too violent, a little too dark, a little too dystopian. I like a little bit of sweetness and light in my Doctor Who, and that's one of the things about the black and white era that still speaks to me. The Hartnell and Troughton eras are still pretty emotionally safe, not a whole lot of unpleasantness. I mean, there's frights and there's scares going on, but everyone really tends to get along, apart from the very, very first couple of Hartnell episodes, and that is quickly dispensed with in favor of a happy TARDIS team, especially when you have Ian and Barbara and Vicky together. So, season 22, the Colin Baker era, has undergone a pretty good critical reevaluation, especially because Colin has done so much work with Big Finish and has really had a chance to play the character that he always wanted to play, not what JNT and the dystopian Eric Sayward foist upon him in the mid-1980s. Season 22, we now, of course, have the Blu-rays. Looks great. We have the Behind the Sofa. We have the extra commentaries. it's really hard to hate season 22 now, almost 40 years later. It's just difficult to sustain that level of hatred for anything if you've been a fan of the show this long. And for me, we're coming up on 40 years. I have episodes that I love, episodes that I like, episodes that I'm indifferent to. Even a bad classic series episode, I'm still going to be watching every couple of years. So really can't hate anything anymore. But if you ask me my favorite era of the show, and there are many of them, the Colin Baker era is still not my favorite, and that's not Colin's fault at all. I have really come to love the energy that he brought to the Doctor. If you look at even less successful stories like Twin Dilemma and Time Lash, with the one exception of him trying to strangle Perry at the beginning of Twin Dilemma, he brings a physicality to the role, and he brings a really dry, caustic humor to the role that you have to watch it in isolation. You might not like the stories or the writers or the Eric Sayward era or some of JNT's fashion choices, but Colin Baker is always knocking it out of the park. Same with Jodie Whittaker. When I was on the Jodie wrap-up panel at Li Who last weekend, it was the same thing. You have to separate out what the showrunner does against what the star does. Jodie and Colin, for that matter, are not producing their own episodes. They're not writing their own scripts. They're not plotting out their own story arcs. You really have to watch what they're doing in isolation. And in that regard, I love Colin Baker's Doctor, even if I don't really care to watch any of his stories as often as I might watch a Logopolis or a Leisure Hive or Inferno or Ambassadors of Death or any of my other stone cold favorites. Same with Jodie. I really don't appreciate a lot of the writing choices and the way she's sidelined in a lot of her stories, but I love the work that she does when you ignore everything else. Now, this character is the security guard on the planet. That actor later came back in the new series and played Martha Jones's father, if memory serves me right. I had read this novelization before I saw the episodes on TV, so I had a very different take on it. I loved the novelization in a way that I had not loved Vengeance on Varos. So watching this for the first time after having read the book, oh, look at Brian Blessed. Just lying on a couch without moving a muscle and glaring at the camera. He is something else. He is absolutely something else. We're lucky to have him in Doctor Who, even in a part where he's not moving a muscle for the entirety of, well, moving a leg there. Otherwise, not really moving a muscle for the entirety of part one. So the book really spoke to me. Obviously, there's a lot going on. You don't quite know what's the truth in the Matrix versus what is the Valeyard's fabrication. And Perry dies, and then we find out 2 pages later that she didn't die. But I liked the humor in the book. I'll be getting to those novelizations much later on. I'm going, of course, in publication order. Next week, we start January 1980. It'll be a long time before the Philip Martin books come up on this show. It's almost a tale of 2 books for him, because the novelization of Vengeance on Varos, while it contains a lot of material, scenes, and humor that was deleted from TV, so you have a much more interesting take on the story, the run-on sentences are just awful, and it's a very difficult book to read because there are just so many run-on sentences everywhere that Terrence Dicks we are obviously not dealing with. Now, looking at Wikipedia now to take a break, it says that the novelization of Mind Warp didn't come out until June 1989, and I know that I read the book before I saw the story on television, and I've already told you that I would have seen The Mysterious Planet in September or October 1987, or whenever Rosh Hashanah was that year. So what that means is I probably did not get to see Mind Warp on television the following week. It probably would have been Yom Kippur, probably would have been in synagogue, probably did not set the VCR for whatever reason. So that's interesting. I remember for a fact, I have vivid memories of watching Mysterious Planet for the first time, but I must have missed Mind Warp and not seen it again until about 1990 or so, because the book doesn't come out until 89, and I know for a fact that I read the book before I saw the episode on television. Shows you what a casual fan I was by that point in the late 1980s. I could miss an entire episode and not really be too bothered about it. That certainly would not be the case in this day and age. Yes, the Lucoser. It's not a bad makeup job, but I think it's a pretty silly idea for a monster. But the actor plays him with a lot of dignity, which that's not a very good screenshot. The actor plays him with a dignity that the makeup doesn't really lend, and I think the book gets into it a little bit more. This is really a tragic figure, even though Perry is now saying, "Here, boy, here, boy." Oh, my goodness. So, again, the novelization I really enjoyed. So the TV story, again, this is average for me. I enjoy it. I don't love it. If I'm sitting down on a Sunday afternoon and I'm home alone and I have spare time to watch 90 minutes of Doctor Who, this is never the story that I'm going to pull out. I did watch it most recently as part of my pilgrimage, would have come to it in late 2021. I know I posted on Twitter about it. This is only a little over a year ago. I don't even remember what I said. So let's take a look at the rankings. I have open on my web browser the 2014 DWM poll, typed up stories 1 through 241. Let's see where this lands. So the Mysterious Planet and Mind Warp and Terror of the Vervoids and the Ultimate Foe are all given different rankings in parentheticals. But that particular poll treated Trial of a Time Lord as a single story. So, and there's Christopher Ryan playing a monster. He later came back to play a Sontaran a few times in the new series. And there's everyone's favorite Syl. I am not as big a fan of Syl as everyone else, but it is a remarkable performance. Not really pitched to my level of interest, but you really have to respect an actor who goes for it on that level. So Trial of a Time Lord is ranked as 168 out of 241 all time. That puts it in the bottom third of Doctor Who stories. What's interesting is that the person who compiled this DWM survey for blog form broke it down so that you also see where the individual parts are ranked. So Mind Warp is ranked at number 174 out of 241. And that's in parentheticals. And this is a droo.blogspot.com, droo.blogspot.com/2014/from-doctor-who-magazines-first-numeral50. You can also just Google DWM 2014 poll, and this will be the first link that you get. So Trial of a Time Lord is 168, but Mind Warp in parentheticals would be 174 if treated as its own separate story. What's interesting is that it's a tie at 174. It's also tied with Terror of the Vervoids and the Leisure Hive, as we call it in the States, or the Leisure Hive, as you would call it in the UK. I love Leisure Hive, and we're coming to that book a lot sooner than we are in the novelizations than we are to the Philip Martin books. The Leisure Hive, the acting, the story, the soundtrack, the effects, the chemistry between Tom Baker and Lalla Ward. I have Leisure Hive probably in my top 50, if not a little bit higher in the classic series. So why Leisure Hive is down there at 174, I haven't the foggiest idea. And while we're at the Chase at 175, I would have Chase probably 125 points higher. Again, I love the Chase, and not in an ironic way either. That book comes out much later in the life of this podcast, so we're not going to get to it for a while. But down here at the lower levels of the rankings, there are a lot of stories that I love. Leisure Hive at 174, The Chase at 175, Mission to the Unknown at 169, Reign of Terror at 170. Jeez. That's a good. Highlanders at 166. Highlanders is an odd story, but I love the novelization. The Sunmakers at 162. Planet of Fire at 161. I mean, these are stories that I really, really, really enjoy. The Awakening at 155. Well, again, there's a lot of good and a lot of average Doctor Who stories. They can't all be in the top 50, but if I were to do this ranking myself, I would have a lot of these stories much higher. Mind Warp, again, it's middle of the pack for me. Maybe 174 is a little low, but I certainly probably would never have it in my top 100. So we've been talking now, or you've been listening to me talk about my false memory of when I first watched this on television and what my initial reactions were to the novelization. And, of course, I've said a lot of great things about Brian Blessed lying down there. He's giving side-eye to the camera and doing convulsion acting, but he's not actually giving the proper theatrical performance just yet. That will come a little bit later in the story. So we were talking a little bit about Philip Martin's run-on sentences in Vengeance on Varos, the novelization. The Mind Warp novelization, as I recall, does not suffer from that problem. Either the editing was a lot more intense. I think this came out after Peter Darvill Evans had taken over as range editor, or maybe Philip Martin had learned his lessons from the first book. But Mind Warp is a much quicker, I guess the word is pacier, read. It doesn't have the run-on sentence problem. Christopher Ryan does a really good job as Lord Kiv in the story, and I thought he did a terrific job as a Sontaran during the David Tennant era. Now, obviously, there's been no novelization yet for the Sontaran stratagem / the Poison Sky, so probably not an episode that we'll ever talk about on Doctor Who literature. So let me just take this opportunity to say I think Christopher Ryan is one of the best Sontarans, not at the level of Kevin Lindsay, who invented the role, but, and again, not as funny as Dan Starkey, who plays a one-note Sontaran, but that one note is always funny, never not funny. But Christopher Ryan, really good too. I would put him right up there along with Dan Starkey. And I think Jonathan Watson, who played the head Sontaran in the Flux season. I met him at a guest reception at Gallifrey 1 9 months ago. I think his name is Jonathan Watson. Pardon me, I'm pushing 50. My memory is not what it used to be. Stuff that I used to have in my head, and I need to frequently look at the internet to verify that my memory hasn't devolved on me. So since this particular episode is not really that interesting scene by scene, let's just take a look and see if I was correct. That I was correct. It is Jonathan Watson who played all those Sontarans, Commander Riskaw and Commander Skak, according to his Wikipedia page. Alright, I guess my memory has not totally failed you guys yet. Just to give you a little bit of a peek as to what's coming up on this show, we are talking about another less than beloved Doctor Who story next week, the January 1980 novelization of Underworld. And if you talk about your DWM 2014 survey, I should say, Underworld ranks at number 236, so it just misses the bottom 5, far and away the lowest ranked Tom Baker story. I would have Underworld a little bit higher than that. If you're talking about a bottom 6 story, it's got to be a story that I hate, and I will never hate Underworld. The actor who plays Crozier is also doing a really good job. I think his name is Patrick Reichart. It's a particular kind of villain acting on Doctor Who, and when I was doing my cliffhangers panel at LI Who last week, along with Heather and Drew, we showed a lot of the great, all-time great, straight-to-camera villain rants in Doctor Who. We watched Underwater Menace Part 3 with Joseph First yelling at the camera. We watched Time Lash Part 1, where Paul Darrow is making not a meal, but a 7-course banquet of his cliffhanger lines as Tecker. So Patrick Reichart doesn't ever get to do a direct-to-camera rant for a cliffhanger in the story, but he would have done a really good job of it had he been allowed to. So we've had Lord Kiv ranting at the camera, and now we have a pulsating brain and an extreme close-up of Peri's nose as seen through a magnifying glass. I like Peri's costume in this story. I think Nicola Bryant always had to wear bright colors so that her wardrobe wasn't drowned out on camera by Colin Baker's color. I think they had to wear the same or similar color patterns so the camera wouldn't be thrown off. That's a pretty good look on her. I'm never going to be a fan of Colin Baker's coat. Again, I have nice things to say about the actor, if not the stories that he was forced to act in, but I'm not really a cosplay kind of guy, but I would never be... There's no universe in which I would ever wear that coat, even at a convention. Again, not my favorite Doctor Who costume. And now we are getting Syl reunited face-to-face with the Doctor and Peri for the first time since Vengeance on Varos. again, you really have to respect the work that Nabil Shaban, if I'm pronouncing that right, is putting in. Really just going for it as a villain. Now, I didn't show Vengeance on Varos Part 1 in my cliffhangers panel. That's actually a pretty good cliffhanger for the Colin Baker years. The ones that I showed this year for Colin Baker were Twin Dilemma Part 1 and, of course, Time Lash Part 1. But Sill's acting in the Vengeance on Varos Part 1 cliffhanger, or as it was aired in the States in the 1980s, Part 2, when it was truncated into a 4-part story. That's really, really good villain acting. So let me make a note of that. If you see me at Elihu at 2023 talking about cliffhangers, remind me that I am supposed to show Vengeance on Varos Part 1 as one of my Colin Baker cliffhangers. And now we're coming hard up on the cliffhanger here. So the Doctor is strapped to a table, and Crozier is looking very menacingly off camera at Sill. And Sill is now really enjoying his voice acting. Now the Doctor is strapped to a table, and here comes the scream acting with a close-up on Colin Baker's jowls. And now we come to our closing credits. So you'll notice that I spent most of the last 25 minutes doing my impromptu commentary, not really talking about the plot of the story itself. I'm more interested in where it fits into Doctor Who's behind-the-scenes history. So we talked about JNT, talked about Eric Sayward, talked about the acting performances, talked about the novelization. Last year, I did 2 of these commentaries. I think this year, in order to prevent this episode from running to 2 hours in length, I'm only going to do the one. But just for fun, let's go to the random generator and see what I would have watched if I was doing a second. My kid is always getting on me for the sheer number of tabs that I have open on Chrome. There we are. There's back to the episodegenerator.com/doctor-who-old. Oh, the Mask of Mandragora Part 2. I recently covered Mask of Mandragora. Philip Hinchcliffe and I talked about that here a couple of months ago, so I'm not going to watch that episode through and talk about it with you. But you can go back and play that episode. I'm a big fan of Mask of Mandragora, and it was a blast talking to Philip Hinchcliffe about that when I did. And you can find that at episode 38. It was an interview with Philip Hinchcliffe to start off, then my review of the book, and then we had Graham Burke for a really lively chat. That was Graham's most recent appearance on this show, but it's definitely not going to be his last. You can be sure that we are going to hear from Philip and Graham again in the near future. So I'm not going to do a commentary for Mask of Mandragora Part 2, but it's a good story. And if you are a fairly recent arrival at the Doctor Who Literature podcast, I do invite you to go back and explore my back catalog. We had Philip Hinchcliffe in episode 29 talking about Seeds of Doom, along with Shannon Dohar as another guest. She did a great job. Have to get her back on here soon. And we had Philip Hinchcliffe and Graham Burke in episode 38, Mask of Mandragora. Philip Hinchcliffe's third novelization and my final interview with him are also coming up on this show within the next couple of months. We have a lot of other guests lined up for you. So next week we'll be talking about Underworld with Fraser. I usually don't announce my guests in advance, but Fraser has been talking a lot about his upcoming appearance on this show to discuss Underworld. So of course I am not going to rain on his parade. Very excited to have Fraser back, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what his guest reading is going to be. He always does a great job with those guest readings. So thank you for listening to me talk about Elihu, and thank you for listening to me talk about my little audio commentary for Trial of a Time Lord Part 5 / Mind Warp Part 1. Next week on Doctor Who Literature is the first book of the 1980s, January 1980. The first decade where I was alive for every single day of it. And Underworld, again, one of the lowest ranked Doctor Who stories of all time in 2014. I acknowledge its flaws, but I am generally fond of the story, and I really love the book for reasons that Fraser and I will talk about next week. Episode 53, Doctor Who and the Underworld, next time on Doctor Who Literature. Thank you for joining me. on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. Special thanks to my producers this week, Irene Richard and Drew Meyer. Literally could not have put this show together without them. Thanks as well to Hannah Long and Jan Fennick and Heather and Wesley for sitting down with me for guest interviews. And apologies to Irene, who I was supposed to interview for this podcast as well, but since she was in charge of media at the con, she did not have time to sit with me. But we will get her back on here so you can hear her speak at length. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at anchor.fm/DoctorWhoLit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's DrWhoNovels. My old tweets about the entire series under the hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage, that's DrWhoPilgrimage. My current Twilight Zone watch-through under hashtag TZPilgrimage. And on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Coming a little bit later this week is my episode of the Trap 1 podcast, where you will hear my full interviews with Bav and John Davey and Matthew and Vanessa and the delightful, well, they're all delightful, but the especially delightful Wendy Padbury. I played snippets from those interviews, advanced excerpts to tease you this week, and then in a few days you can hear the full one of each of those interviews on the Trap 1 podcast. I will post a link to that Trap 1 episode in the show notes for next week, but it will be out before next week, so please give that a listen. Thank you for listening to the Doctor Who Literature Podcast, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who Podcast Network.